So we'll get started. So I want to thank everyone from coming here. We've got an incredible panel here. So if you woke up this morning and said, well, I'm not smart enough, what's going to get me smarter today? We've got three incredible guests for you. Just to your, I guess as you face right to left here, I want to welcome Heather Fatali.
You got it.
Heather just told me she is the now proud proprietor of a immigration firm in Bellingham. She's been there a long time. She also reminded me that back in the day when our office was not downtown Vancouver, but it was in Steveston, she and her partner Greg Bowes came and they spoke to us about immigration. And I know Emily Shan, you may remember that. That's probably 10 years ago, and it's a fantastic memory. So we're great to have her here today. We've got Darren Coleman from Toronto, and he assures me that this was the right day to come, and that if it had been a couple days ago, he might not have been able to get here, and something about snow and depth.
All that global warming on my driveway. There's so much of it. It's wild.
Yeah, and we may tease them in Toronto, but we all know in Vancouver, if there's a half a foot of snow, it's a disaster. So we won't tease you this time. And last, Krista Rabideau, my partner from Calgary, and she's partnered with Anderson in our office there. The three of them are going to go through a title, Don't Get Kicked in the Assets. They have been rehearsing this for months. Take it away, you three. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. The intention behind this is a case study that we're going to go through our panel. However, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please do interrupt us and talk to us. We will self-moderate ourselves until someone potentially asks a question. Although if you do have a question, Krista, right there, kind of in the middle, has a microphone. We do ask that you use the microphone for your questions so that the video can pick it up, because we are recording the audio and the video as well. So please do that.
This is for the gram?
This is for the gram. We're actually going to get a Grammy for this. Nobody even knows it yet. But yeah, there's a new category, Geek People, a category. So what we're talking about today entails both tax, immigration, and family succession, which is something that's happening more and more in the world, around our country and around the globe. The borders have extremely opened up in the world, so when you're doing succession for a family, generally there's going to be some type of international or cross-border component to it nowadays, not always, but it's a high probability that there's a beneficiary or a parent, as in this case, wanting to move countries and figure out how to relocate and how to protect their assets while they do that. Hence the title, Don't Get Kicked in the Assets, because when you don't plan properly, you generally lose more assets than you intend to in the beginning. And so we're going to go through our different things, and we'll talk a little about what we do. I know Steve did a general introduction, but maybe we'll start with you, Darren.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for attending today. We appreciate you have many choices for lunch, so thank you for choosing this option. So I lead Portage Cross-Border Wealth Management. We're based in Oakville. We also have an office about 3 blocks from here in Vancouver. There's a team. There's 13 of us now, 14. I'm losing track of how many of this are. And we kind of pioneered the cross-border space 14 years ago with Raymond James. We've just are in the middle of launching our own independent investment counseling firm in Canada and an RIA in the US, so we'll become fully independent and change one of our custodians. So we pioneered this because I've been in the business for 34, oh dear God. Anyway, I'm only 26, so the math is hard. But we pioneered this because as a wealth manager, so many people are like our case study where they have money or family on both sides of the border. And if you've been in this business, you're aware that financial institutions just do not help. And that causes more chaos than people probably expect. So we pioneered solutions for that. So today I'll be taking it from the perspective of how do they actually deal with the money in the movement of this. And there you go.
Hello, everyone. I'm Heather Fatali, and I am with Cascadia Cross-Border Law. We're located just over the border in Bellingham, Washington. I focus primarily on business immigration, and due to our proximity to the border, the vast majority of my client base is Canadian business people. My passion is working with Canadian business people who are looking to expand to the United States or who are already operating in the United States. Identifying the right structure and the right path to work from an immigration perspective, and setting things up in a way that is optimized both from an immigration perspective as well as a tax perspective. So working really closely with the tax team, with the cross-border business council, to make sure that the whole plan is harmonized, ideally well in advance of that expansion. On the flip side, I also work in the realm of renunciation and working with clients that are seeking out advice on that side as well, dual citizens. So I'm really excited to be speaking with you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Darren and Heather. And as Steve said, I'm Krista. I am a partner with Anderson, and I practice in the same area as Steve within the international private client world. So I am dealing with individuals generally who own businesses, and they themselves are cross-border or their business is cross-border, and working on it from the tax perspective and planning and reporting, and working very closely with my financial advisor and lawyer immigration people in structuring and corporate structuring. So for the case study today, what we have here is we have Joe and Susan Smith, who are getting ready to potentially retire and pass over their business to their daughter. Thankfully, in this business case, there's only one child, so there's less complexities.
These are not their real names.
No, not at all.
I don't think they are.
So what's going to happen, though, is as soon as Joe and Susan transfer their business to their daughter to take over as CEO, themselves want to move to the United States to enjoy sunnier, warmer weather that exists down there. And so what we'll be doing throughout the case study is talking about the different tax perspectives you need to contemplate throughout that planning phase in advance, as Heather said. Financial assets, now they're potentially going to have cash if they have the daughter buy it or versus giving it to her. What happens with all of that, and the immigration for them? How do they even get into the United States? And so from a initial perspective, when you look at this, what do you think stands out most as the significant risk that exists to them if proper planning was not done in advance?
Who's going to go first? Jump off.
Heather.
Yes.
If proper planning was not done in advance, then I would say the significant risk is timelines, because U.S. immigration, no matter what path we're choosing, does take some lead time. And it's always very difficult to be in a situation where somebody needs to be in the U.S. now, and we're looking at months or even years in some cases, depending on the path that that person is seeking. So, yeah.
So their biggest risk is they think they can move there before the rain starts here, and they find out that it's actually the rain next year, not this year. Okay. Yeah. Biggest risk is delay. How about for you? Or not being let in?
Well, because we'll get a situation like this. Someone says, I want to move to the United States, or an American wanting to move to Canada. And our first thing is, how are you going to do that? I think the immigration issue is the first one. And not to put too fine a point on it, but if you're going to the U.S., your immigration status is kind of important right now. So if you're going to go, how are you going to go? What visa you're going to use? What's your intent? Because most people have no awareness of how complicated this is. So that's actually one thing we check first is, like, do you have a good immigration counsel? You're going in correctly, and you know the rules and everything else. I think the next biggest risk is this is such a complicated scenario, even though the case study sounds simple, it's so connected. We have a great word a friend of mine from Newfoundland has a great word. He says when it's complicated, it's tangly. It's fantastic. And this is so tangled up. So I think for a client like this, it's making sure they have the right team that is engaged with them, that all talk to each other. So you need a great immigration counsel. You need cross-border taxation counsel. You need an investment person, financial person that can handle the move. So making sure the right people are there and they can then build the plan that is coordinated, I think that's the biggest risk, is missing a piece, right?
Yeah, missing a piece like that. And I think from my perspective, there's two different areas. I agree with you wholeheartedly. When someone's crossing a border,
this is recorded. She agreed with me. I just want to make a note of that.
The advisors need to be in a room together. And I think too often, as advisors, we're trained to solve solutions and not necessarily think about what solution Darren has proposed and what solution Heather has proposed and amalgamate them together. We're getting there. I have a designation as a family enterprise advisor, and one of the main principles that's talked about within that designation is the team, right? You can't go into it and build a tax plan that's fantastic tax planning, but it truly messes up their immigration. Vice versa, can't create a visa or an immigration status and entities that's going to actually cause them double tax. But that still exists today within advisors that are giving advice to people, that they don't actually all sit around the table and go, okay, how does this affect you? How does it affect you? And how does it affect us for the client as a team? So that's a really huge risk that they talk about in family enterprise advising.
We see that. Like, we'll have, a tax person or a legal person create a trust, for example, that will work great, except, that person's in the other country. So how do I even open an account to do this? Because the Securities Act and the banking regulations are not the same as the legal rules for immigration or for trust. So this is where having all the right people at the table that actually know how to do this is really essential. Because some of this stuff, and we've seen people have really complicated architecture that might work if everyone was in Michigan. But as soon as one person's in Ontario, sorry, this doesn't work. So the $50,000 you spent to build this thing doesn't work now. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going both ways, right? Yeah. I know, aside from this case study, I'm working with someone right now who is planning to move from California to Vancouver, and got this great trust plan, like amazing 100-page planning document from their US lawyer. And I said, that's nice, throw it out. Like, you can't use it, you're coming to Canada. There's no point, because you're only coming here for 4 years, you want departure tax. Okay, there you go, you can have departure tax. But it's actually getting the people all together to talk through things. And the other thing I would say from this component, is the departure tax, obviously. If they leave Canada and they still own the shares, they've got a huge tax bill potentially coming their way. They could probably do some elections to defer, but what's that exposure and what do they have to do? And if they don't think about it, and you talked about it in advance, if we don't do it in advance, cleaning up is way harder to do and than doing it right in the first place and talking to the people right in the first place.
I would also add that the team is so important, and it is typically distinct team members. Taxes and immigration are famously like the two most complicated areas of the law, and you don't typically want somebody that does both, one person that does both. Maybe a firm offers both services, but if you have a professional that says, I can do your taxes, I can do your immigration, I can form your entity, that's probably the wrong person.
Well, I'll take it even one step further. If you have a professional that says, I can do your Canadian business tax and your US business tax and your personal tax in Canada and the US, my answer is no, you can't. Like, there is so many rules out there to be an expertise in every single rule. It doesn't exist. However, there's a lot of people out there who profess that they can do everything, and that means they're a generalist, which is fine. It's like your GP doctor. You're not going to go to your GP doctor for a knee surgery, right? Like, you're not going to do it. So why would you put your own wealth and your own assets at risk by going to someone who's a general practitioner that practices everything at a superficial level versus an expertise level? Continuing a little bit further down this, if we were to think that this was an absolutely straightforward plan, nothing.
Well, it's widgets. How hard can it be?
It's
right?
widgets, exactly. They're retiring, they're going to move, they've transitioned to the child. Why do we turn this complex? Why do we make this complex when they're just retiring and it's one child? It's an easy succession. They don't have to go to anybody else. And they're moving to the U.S. Thousands of people move to the U.S. every day.
We didn't make it complex. It is. Right?
Okay, well,
it just is.
It is, exactly.
It just is.
Yeah,
right?
and
you've got different countries, different regulations, different rules, different banking systems, none of this lines up. And I will say this, it does shock people and any of you that work in cross-border now know this, no one gets how hard this is until they're eyeballs deep in it. And my joke is it's like they walked out of the mall, the wrong door, and they can't find the car. Everything kind of looks normal, but what's going on? I don't understand. And it's because our phones work in the same country. We watch the same TV shows. Why is it hard? So I'd say that's one of the other risks, to go back to that first question, is people really underestimate how diabolically hard this is to do. Right, and it looks easy, and I think that clients get frustrated when the answers are hard, they're complicated. It depends is usually the answer to most questions, and it's expensive to navigate to the right answer. But not doing it right is way more expensive, right?
Yeah. Do you have anything to add, Heather?
I would just add that again, I think it comes back to working with the right team in advance that have the right connections. So, for example, you've got folks, maybe they're getting their immigration pathway solidified, and it comes to be that they need to go open up a U.S. bank account. Well, I have a business attorney friend that works in cross-border, and he always says the farther away you get from the border, the more foreign a country Canada becomes. Maybe in Washington State, Bellingham, where I'm located, a lot of the banks are like, oh yeah, we love Canadians, that's easy for us, but you bounce down to Texas or Florida, that could be very different. So working with professionals who say, yes, I know this, this banking institution or this banking connection who you should talk to. So that can really help contain or control some of those complexities.
So let's take a little bit deeper dive into this, and I'll stick with you, Heather, to start with. If you think about the Smiths want to go to the U.S., right? We know they have a lot of money. They don't have a business down there. They just want to go down there and enjoy their Canadian money. If you were to think of this from a legal immigration perspective solely, what do you think is potentially some gaps in them being able to get into the U.S., and what are the things that are in their favor, I guess, and how they would do this?
So just to be clear from the hypo, I wanted to confirm whether they have a U.S. business at this point or not. If we're going with they have a very successful Canadian business that's been doing trade with U.S. Customers, no U.S. business at this point. What they have in their favor is this solid Canadian business, and if a substantial portion of these millions of dollars in revenue a year that their business is generating is in sales of widgets to U.S. customers, then I'm immediately thinking about what's called the E1 visa, which is a visa, and it's a pretty darn fantastic visa for Canadian citizens, by the way, that's based on a Canadian company that is engaged in substantial trade with U.S. customers. It's a pretty fast track to getting them to the U.S., and that would be a short-term pathway that I'd be looking at, but I'd also be concerned about they want to live in the U.S., they want to retire in the U.S., so what does that look like in terms of advanced planning? And we can talk more about that, but.
Sure. And I mean, it's interesting to me because the e-visa, the most common question I often get, it's usually not a question they tell me. I talked to a lawyer down in the U.S. in Florida. They've set me up with an LLC sub so that I can get my e-visa, and I'm just going to transfer my money. And from a tax perspective, Krista's going, wow, double tax, double tax, double tax.
Yeah.
But it's the immigration person. I mean, everybody in the U.S. uses LLCs. I think every human has one down there, even if they don't need it. But it's the worst thing we can do for a Canadian, especially if it's a subsidiary of the Canadian company that you're now going to have potentially revenue in.
As a business immigration lawyer, the minute I see LLC, I'm like, oh no, you need to go talk to your Canadian tax person and make sure that works, because sometimes we see it for very specific intentional reasons, but typically I know that's going to result in double taxation. So I'll send them right back to their tax people to get that straightened out.
By the way, do most people in the room know why that mismatch causes a problem? I don't know if we should spend a second on why LLCs for Canadians are problematic, because they use them for businesses, they use them in real estate.
Let me ask the question the other way. Does anybody want us to take a section on why LLCs are bad? Okay, we can do that.
Just thought we should touch on
Yeah, sure. So limited liability company down in the U.S. is considered a hybrid entity. So in the U.S. it's disregarded if it's wholly owned by one person, meaning that it's not really actually it's not a filing tax company down in the United States, it's a flow-through. And so what happens is in the US, they're picking up income on their personal returns. It's like they're doing it themselves, but it creates a liability protection. However, from a Canadian perspective, a limited liability company is actually a corporation. And so because it's a disregarded entity in the US and a corporation in Canada, it is not actually a taxpayer getting all the tax treaty benefits. And so you can end up that the US is saying, no, it's this way, and Canada is saying, no, it's this way, and with the two countries not talking to each other and the tax treaty benefits not existing because it's a hybrid entity and not a taxpayer, you're now subjected to potential double tax if it's not reported correctly. Now, there's mechanisms to get around that, obviously, but just purely having an LLC in that case can create many different types of exposures, even on fund transfers, if there's dividend repatriations, if you're whatever, right? And similarly, from a ULC perspective, there is, because it's a hybrid as well, you have similar type of things you need to be careful of. Anytime you have a company that's treated one way in one country and it's called something different in another country, you have that exposure to the double tax because of the treaty.
No, that's good. We see this a lot when people have vacation properties in the U.S. You know, the Canadian family will be talking to that other family they see in season that's from Michigan, and they say, well, I rent it out twice a year on Airbnb, and the American family says, oh my God, you better put that in LLC, so if someone trips over the toilet and breaks their foot, they don't sue you. So then they do, and then they discover that I'm getting like 80% tax on my money. Like, what the heck happened here? And it's just because what might work for an American, it could be very toxic for the Canadians. So this is just one example. I just thought we should take a second, because that's a very common mistake people make.
And it's usually indicative of the fact that they're not working with a cross-border tax professional. That's one of my...
That's true. And the thing is, like, they'll go visit the nice lawyer in Naples or Phoenix that did it for everybody else in the neighborhood, but they don't know that, and again, proximity from the border, right? They don't know that our rules are different.
It goes both ways. I see quite often Canadian domestic people giving advice to someone not understanding what they've tripped up in the U.S., right? So it's really somebody who has the language or understanding of both sides of the border is actually quite important whenever you have a cross-border person. Darren, I'm going to flip over to you a little bit to talk about all this money and assets that they're going to have, and they're no longer going to be a Canadian resident, so technically they can't trade in Canada anymore with all their money. Yeah. And so if there's a lot of big major shift in cash happening with them leaving, what would you think is the first things they need to do for their financial plan leaving Canada? Yeah,
so there's a lot to do. We do this a lot, so we've got a lot of checklists and other things. I think the first step is having clarity on exactly what do they have. So doing an audit of what exactly are the account types, who owns what, understand, because some accounts will stay in Canada, like the registered accounts, for example, they're RSPs. Others, they can't retain here, so we have to figure out how to move the assets that are in them. Some assets are portable, like if they own a share of Royal Bank or Microsoft, that can go. How is it taxed when it goes? That's a whole other conversation. But then how do they move it there? Because if they try to move it to a U.S. financial institution that's never done a transfer with a Canadian institution, both groups have their binders out trying to figure out what page this is on and how does this work, and they will screw it up. They also need to be aware that some of the answers to what they can do are not going to be found on the internet, because there's the rules and then there's policies. And for example, an RSP, if you move to the United States, you're allowed to keep it, but the question is, will your financial institution want you to keep it with them? Because there's registration requirements and exemptions, because the general rule is that financial institutions and the advisors have to be licensed where the client is domiciled. So if you're in one country and your money is in the other, this is a mess. And there are exemptions and things that exist, but they're all different. So for example, RSPs, when you move to the United States, not every state recognizes the tax treaty of Canada, so some will offer tax deferral, others won't. You need to know that before you go. But also, there's exemptions from registration. So if you're a Canadian advisor and the client moves to the United States, you might be able to do business with them, but it depends on what state they went to, and then do you need to be registered in the state? So New York, for example, is fine. Rhode Island isn't. And there's 3 different models for exemptive relief. The problem is that most financial institutions, they don't want to get involved with this. So even though the rules may say you could keep your account, the financial institution might say, you know, we don't want to be dealing with this. So you could get a letter from them saying you can't have your account here anymore. And you can't dig that up on the internet. And it depends on which division of the bank you're in. They'll have slightly different rules. In the U.S., if someone's moving, this is the opposite of this case study. If someone's moving from the U.S. to Canada, they're definitely going to have their accounts orphaned. So knowing what they have, and then each account's going to have its own treatment, and it has to have its own strategy for what do we do here. And there's also some assets that just can't go to the U.S. So for example, if they own a mutual fund or a Canadian ETF, you're not going to be able to take that with you. So do you have a plan to get rid of that?
And you don't want to own it because you have extra reporting with the passive foreign investment company, right? I think, and does it matter if they do planning before they go or after they go?
Yeah, don't do after because that's chaos.
Yeah.
So doing it ahead is great because we can understand what accounts we have, what we don't have, what do we need. And our team, because we're licensed in operationable countries, we can often set everything up that we need in the other place. And it's the same group of people that are moving it. So they just go from one computer screen to the other, as opposed to everybody flipping through the binder going, I've never done this before, how do I do this?
Yeah, just to revert back to your question on the letter from the bank that you can't have your account here anymore. It's interesting because the wording just says you can't have your account here anymore. Nowhere does it say you're not actually allowed to have an RSP. And quite often I get people who call me and say, well, my bank told me I have to withdraw everything. And it's like, well, no, you don't have to prepay all your tax. You just need to get it somewhere that it can actually be held and continued to make money for you. And not have to prepay tax on a big investment. But it's interesting because people will get that letter and think, I have to withdraw it all. The bank can't hold it. And it's like, well, no, they can't.
Right.
And there are institutions out there, such as you guys, who can hold it and allow it to continue to earn money. And I think, so there's a whole bunch of things that unfolded here from a tax perspective. I already alluded to the departure tax if they continue to own the company and don't potentially do some planning to get it to her daughter in advance. But either way, they're going to have this wealth, whether it's in investments or preferred shares or whatever the case may be. But the other thing is on the U.S., if they get a U.S. domicile, depending on how they immigrate and how long that they've been there, they now have a huge estate tax exposure that they haven't maybe planned for. Being worth $100 million, the estate tax exposure is limited to $50 million-ish right now for each person, so they're well above that. And the tax on that is quite a bit significant higher than the U.S. tax on, or Canadian side of the border when you're dealing with the gains and stuff. And so if you don't have proper planning put in place to hopefully mitigate some of that estate tax exposure that exists, then you're going to definitely lose potentially half your assets to U.S. if you get U.S. domicile, depending on what they do.
Yeah, and that could be, and think about that. So the person has a deemed disposition in Canada. That's what the exit tax is. So they've got an enormous tax bill to the Canadian government. They move to wherever they go to Florida, and then they're going to have a huge estate tax
On value.
on the value when they go. Like, what? So we've had people that have gone through this exercise and thought, maybe I'm not going to do this. Maybe I'll just stay in Canada, or if I want to become non-resident.
Snowboard.
Yeah, or I'll find another
Snowboard.
jurisdiction. Like Cayman Islands might be quite nice. Maybe I'll do that. So the decisions that they make sometimes are based on what their desire is, but if they don't have all the information, maybe that isn't the right decision.
From an immigration perspective, in terms of all of this planning, what I find is very important is that the client needs to understand that this move is going to be, although there are personal reasons behind it, very much tied to the business presently and for the next couple of years. So it is critical to know at that planning stage from an immigration perspective, what is the plan with the business? If it is just a Canadian business, there's no U.S. entity at this point, my questions are going to be like, where do these widgets come from? Are they manufactured in Canada? Are they manufactured elsewhere? If they're manufactured in Canada, there's all this tariff stuff happening. Are you going to move the manufacturing to the U.S.? Are you going to continue manufacturing in Canada and have ongoing cross-border trade? These are questions that are going to play into whether or not, from a short-term perspective, we're looking at an E1 visa, maybe in the name of the Canadian company. We don't have to worry about structuring a U.S. company immediately. Or maybe we look at establishing that U.S. subsidiary, investing in that U.S. entity, and developing an E2 visa. These folks also say that they're interested in retiring in the U.S., living in the U.S. full-time, permanently. Well, that means that they're either going to need to we'll need to identify a green card pathway for them, which, again, is going to be tied to the business unless they have some lucky family tie that would support a green card application. You can't just apply for a green card. You need to have a family connection or a business basis for that application.
But even if you do have a family connection, you better get in line now because it could take 15 years before they get your application off the shelf.
It literally could, depending on that family relationship. So there's a lot there that is very important from the get-go to identify that is specific to the business and what the goals are, what's realistic, because the answers to those questions are going to lead me as an immigration attorney to determining whether or not an E-1 is appropriate, or are we going to invest in a U.S. company and go the E-2 route. Maybe we're looking at something called an L, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, and even just bringing up the family dynamics, there's the whole family dynamics of founders successing a business to the next gen. In general, I would say it's a minimum 5-year succession. And so when you talk about the business and the succession, yes, the daughter is taking over the business, but is dad or mom really still controlling everything? Are they making all the decisions? And we now have mind and management in the US because they're living in the US and just doing everything through a phone, but still running the business because the most common phrase I hear from a founder is they're just not ready yet to do it all by themselves, right? And that's even if the person's 55 years old, they're still not, in the parents' eyes, they're not ready for some reason because a child is always a child. And so when you're thinking about the succession planning, if someone is immediately going to jump a border, however, they're maintaining control of the company, you're now going to the flags of, is there a potential with permanent establishment for this company that is now going to become a U.S. resident company, and is there any type of reporting or treaty tie-breaking we have to do for this company in the United States, because mom and dad are still actually controlling the business, and daughter's just a figurehead right now because they're still slowly transitioning all of the control over to her. Or does dad stay, do they set up a family office and dad's the chairman of the board of this company and the family office? You really, like, there's so many components you have to think about, and maybe dad is working in the US for this Canadian company and still concluding contracts, selling widgets, right? Everybody's working remote now and they think it doesn't have any implications, but it really does. If you're concluding contracts in another country, like myself, if I go to another country and I'm selling stuff and concluding contracts, I'm not signing it down there. There's absolutely no way I'm going to be doing that if I'm on vacation and talking to a client, because that's triggering something. And it's something, aside from this family, we all really need to keep in our mind, especially if we're leaders within our organization who go on vacation and continue to work for a few weeks, even though we're gone down there, but we're doing stuff and concluding contracts, we might be creating an issue. And that's the same with this family, right? If mom or dad continue to control the company, what are they creating for them from a tax perspective? Are they being paid a salary and they're working down in the US and now they've got salary exposure and payroll exposure? The whole package can unfold very quickly into a highly complex situation. Were you going to add something?
Oh, I was just going to add that the topic of working remotely in the U.S. for a Canadian company is a hotly debated, very gray area these days. I think that the progression of technology has moved a lot faster than the guidance that we have in black and white, at least from a U.S. immigration perspective. And there's a lot of discretion in the hands of CBP. But this comes up all the time for me. I see
like
this question a lot.
If I set my VPN to Canada and I click the contract thing on DocuSign, am I really in Texas? No, these are like...
It's legitimate questions.
Where are you
This
when
is
you
what
did that,
people
right?
are doing right now to circumvent.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, from an immigration perspective, a really good rule of thumb is immigration is gonna look at the context, and they're gonna say, is this person truly in, not tax perspective, but just purely immigration, is this person truly in Disneyland with their family, answering a couple of emails? That's probably that's gonna be permissible, versus is somebody really bordering the line of living in the United States and supporting themselves by tuning in and working remotely for this Canadian company. And then, yeah, you've got these questions about where contracts are concluded, et cetera, that immediately are gonna trigger things. So it's something you really need to be careful of, and again, ideally address before it's an issue.
And I wanted, you mentioned the family dynamics thing. I think that's really important because we've been talking about the mom and dad moving and the daughter running the business. Well, what if somebody gets sick or needs to have attending to this? I was trained as a trust officer a long time ago, so like I start thinking, who can actually go in and help? Because the parents are probably going to assume that the daughter, well, if anything happens to them, daughter can come down and attend to everything. Well, no, she can't, because the U.S. financial institutions will not take any instructions from the Canadian, and it's not because of citizenship, it's residency. They don't live there, they're not going to talk to you. We encounter this regularly. And vice versa, they'll have a similar problem. So if something needs to be done, and mind and management is in which country, and the daughter needs something, well, if mom and dad move to the States, they may not be able to transact on anything as a power of attorney or as an estate trustee. So you don't not just have to think about your immediate family, but who else might have to step in and deal with this? And I'll just extend that and remind everybody, if you don't know this, you should know this. I think the biggest blind spot everyone has in their financial planning personally, and in the next 10 years, this is going to dominate most people's lives, and it's really just a question of which side of the coin you're on. And I think the question is going to be either who's going to look after you or whom might you have to look after? And everybody kind of goes, oh, yeah, you're right. And so I think the vast majority of people are not attending to that. They know it happens. Everybody knows it happens, but nobody wants to talk about it because it could be in any way, shape, or form. You don't know who's going to get sick, when something. And these conversations usually happen in like the nursing home or in the hospital room or in mom's kitchen. So solving the problem for this family, or you can't really solve it, it's just being mindful of how it keeps changing, is recognizing that whatever these solutions are, you have another kind of order, a second order effect that you have to figure out as you go through this. So again, that's why having that team that makes sure that they can really spot all these things from a distance is really important. And you may not have the answer now, but you got to know, maybe I don't need this to know today, but I'm going to have to figure that out in the future.
Awesome. All right. We got about 5 minutes left here. So Heather, quick 1.5 minute summary of just the key takeaways that if you run into a situation like this, what's your key takeaway that everybody in this room can go, oof, I should think about that and call Heather?
I mean, we've said it again and again, advanced planning. I think it is so worthwhile just to connect with a U.S. immigration professional who can look at the facts, identify what the options are based on this narrative here. I mean, we didn't get into detail, but I'm thinking about E1 visa, E2 visa, L, and then potentially a multinational executive manager green card pathway. These options, the temporary options, would be serving immediate goals. The green card option would be serving long-term goals, and we need to tee everything up so it's aligned and also aligned with the tax considerations, because you don't want to win the U.S. immigration battle, lose the tax war. That is not the goal here. Yeah.
Darren.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think back to how I began this, which is getting some clarity on exactly what the situation is, what are the moving parts, what are the accounts, who are all the players. And in many cases for the client, if they have someone expertly guiding them through that, this is often the first time they're even aware of a lot of these things, right? And having multiple people at the table as they go through this is important. And the experts, if the right people are there, will be able to pass along insights, because other people have had this problem too. Yours is uniquely yours, but we've probably dealt with this already. Right? And we know what mistakes you're likely to make. So you get to learn from other people if you do this really well. We often get the people that make mistakes we've never seen before. Those are interesting. Those are really complicated. Don't ever be interesting to science. So having the clarity first and then working with people that have done this before, you'll get the insights of how did other people solve something like this and what to be mindful of. And I think the goal of it is, for the client, is to work in partnership with all these people, because these problems don't go away. Nothing you decide is going to stay. Did President Trump change his mind on anything in the last 4 minutes? Because that's the world we're in now. Like, everything's moving so quickly. So nothing you can write down is going to stay for very long. So it's being adaptable and having that partnership with people to change as things change and as people's desires and interests change is really, really critical, because nothing goes slowly anymore. Everything's fast.
That's true. I need a quick answer. I think from the tax perspective and the family perspective, there's probably three major components that they would want to be looking at, and one is departure tax. How, if they're still owning the company or they've done a freeze, et cetera, how are they mitigating their exposure to departure tax, and what's the plan that needs to be put in place for that? Two would be estate planning, protecting their assets from estate tax in the United States, especially if it's a Canadian company that they are still potentially owning if they haven't done a transition of ownership. And three is, as I said, making sure they're looking through their operations of the entity to make sure they've given up control of that company and that they're not operating in a place of operating the business once they've moved down to the US, even though they've softly transitioned it to the daughter to take over the business, because, as I said, that it can expose a bunch of things. And as the problem I find often with family-owned businesses is they think it's simple because they know who's taking it over, but there's a lot of dynamics, such as the child has learned how to operate under the parents but never to be the owner. So there's a lot of things that actually happen within a business, that there's leadership development, there's ownership development, there's conversations about what are you responsible, and it's very hard for families to self-facilitate themselves through that, especially when it's a parent-child relationship, because mom and dad are always right. So getting the right people in the room to have those conversations and then do the documentation of control so you understand where that's going. We'll open it up to questions from anybody right there.
Actually, just before we get to the next question, what's also interesting, there have been people tabling ideas about extending the ability for a Canadian to stay in the U.S. for up to 270 days without becoming a tax resident. I think if that went through, you see a lot of people saying that's probably enough.
I think that's
for me
kind
to
of
go.
what the gold one
Yeah.
does.
Well, no, but you wouldn't have to pay
No,
for
there's
it.
a different one that you can stay up and you don't get the substantial
You don't-
presence test.
It's a
Again, how do
proposal.
you override the tax code?
Yeah.
Like, you'd have to change the tax
Yeah.
law.
They could. But I'm just saying, like this is why I'm saying it just keeps evolving and changing, right?
It does.
Well, first of all, thank you all so much. This was so interesting. Really appreciate all you being here. I have a question. I'm not sure if you want to touch on this, but there's a lot of like dual citizens, like U.S. and Canadian citizens, or U.S. citizens who want to move back to Canada, and they're concerned about their pension and retirement plans. And I don't know if that's something that
That's
you
every
can give
day.
some tips
Every
on
day
or
we get that.
advise on in terms of that's.
Do you want to take it from financial? I'll do tax.
Sure. So the we get this a lot. We have a lot of returning Canadians, right? That's probably the dominant cross-border thing we get. Because generally when people are moving to the U.S., they don't have the wealth level yet. We get the ones that are returning with their bags of money and their gigantic IRAs and all the 401ks and stuff. So that's a common issue because their 401k, that has one type of treatment on it in terms of the compliance. That you can talk about the tax. So the 401k, they can actually leave it there, and the 401k provider can still deal with the Canadian, right? But an IRA is not the same. It's a different regulatory environment. So if they have an IRA in the States or they want to roll their 401k to an IRA before they go, well, the problem there is that the IRA has a different set of rules from the Securities Act and registration. So the IRA, the institution handling the IRA won't be able to talk to them when they come to Canada. So they'll get one of two letters when they change their address to Markham, Ontario or Langley, British Columbia. And the financial institution, Wells Fargo, Merrill Lynch, whomever it is, will send them a letter saying, oh, you're in Canada now. We can't deal with you. We're not registered in Canada. So they'll get a letter that says either your account is restricted to cells only. We can't take any other instructions from you. Or they get the other one that sometimes that gets sent out that says, oh, you have 90 days, 120 days, whatever it is, to move your account somewhere else, or we're going to send you a check less all the taxes and penalties. So that scares people. Now, the solution to that is there are a small number of institutions that are, and RIAs and things like us, that are set up to be able to, we run the account, it stays in the United States, but we can take instructions because we're also registered in Canada. So there's a very small number of people that do that. We've done that longer than anybody, but more people are learning how to do it. I'd say what's interesting to me, having done this for a long time, is there's more people that say they can do it, but you're back to, do they actually know how this works? So it is possible, and this is a large part of what we do. And you also then have their non-registered accounts. How do those move up here? And understanding what assets can move and what can't move is also a challenge. We had a lady years ago, she had millions of dollars in a bunch of Vanguard mutual funds. And unfortunately, she was a great investor, so she had really substantial embedded capital gains. Unfortunately, those assets don't move to Canada. Mutual funds cannot cross the border. Now, had she bought the equivalent ETF from Vanguard, she could have moved it without triggering a ton of taxes. So understand, that's back to what's the audit, what have you got? So we can run a pathway for all these different things, but having someone who knows how to do it and has done it before, really, really important.
One of the top questions that I have for my renunciation clients is whether by renouncing they are cutting off, the benefits that they've earned in the United States. And my general advice is no, you still can receive the benefits that you've earned during your time as a U.S. citizen. But I'm always like, talk to your tax professional about all the details and logistics of how that will work. But yeah, that's a really common question I hear from renunciation clients.
And I would say from a tax perspective, the two components that I generally look at is it an account that's allowed to be deferred? So for instance, Roths, there's special elections that have to be done, and if not done, they're not deferred. And the other thing is a lot of Canadian financial institutions love to say, just take everything out and transfer it to your RSP. It's tax-free.
Yeah,
you can use a
just
foreign
not-
tax credit. Well, you can if you have other income and you have like a way to use the foreign tax credit, because if you're not creating income, you have nothing to offset the tax against. And unfortunately, it's great because they get it in their portfolio, but it's not always that they're going to be able to use that tax against other income if they have no other income to use that foreign tax credit for. So there's calculations that actually it can be done, but you should do a calculation before you actually do it. So there are probably two major things about retirement.
Yeah, and in our situation, like on that one, we are agnostic, right? So if it makes sense for the client to take their IRA, pull it out, put it into their RSP, and they can use it, that's fine. We'll tell them to do that. If they shouldn't, can't, or that's not the best advice, then we'll say, well, leave the IRA, and we'll manage it for you while you're in Canada. The other element beyond this, besides the administrative and the legal and custody things, are, well, how are you going to do your planning? Because Canadian financial planning software doesn't really have anywhere where you put IRAs in it and what are RMDs and all this other stuff. Whereas we learned to do that. So like Ryan, who's one of my senior financial planners is here, Ryan has to use all these different software tools. Some are Canadian, some are the US, and then understand how to take the data from each one and then put it together on your own. So there's a little bit of, MacGyvering to be able to give the client the right predictability and make decisions around cash flow, because every account type you have is going to have different rules on how you pull money out of it and when and that kind of thing. So understanding that and giving the client some guidance is really a specialty. Yeah.
Thank you.
And depending on if they're renouncing and their net worth, if they have U.S. situs assets that remain the estate tax exposure, right? So there's so many unpacking. There was a hand up over here for Paul.
Thank you. Thanks for all your information. What about the reverse, when you have an opportunity to work in the U.S. but still remain Canadian? How do benefits, your medical, all those good things, and especially the retirement side of things work when you can kind of be double dipping from Canada and the U.S.? Or is that awful and don't do that?
Well, it's not awful, don't do that. However, the tax treaty and immigration dictates things. People often think, well, I'm just going to remain a resident of Canada and just go work in the United States and I'll file in both countries and it's no big deal. But it actually, there is exposure, and it's actually, a lot of people don't know this. In the Income Tax Act of Canada, there's a very small paragraph that actually says if under a tax treaty you are considered a non-resident, you cannot be a resident of Canada for tax purposes. And it's like 2 sentences in the Income Tax Act that's missed the most. And there's a lot of people who try to do this because they think they can do it so that they don't have to pay departure tax. I would say if you're not subject to departure tax, why would you want to remain a Canadian resident, Canada, and pay higher tax rates? Right? If you're going to Texas, for instance, you're only paying federal tax and you're not paying state tax. And why would you want to? And it goes back to a lot of people think immigration and tax are tied. And I have to convince them, no, if you're Canadian, you can come across the border any day. Nobody's going to stop you just because you gave up your tax residency. And then you come back and you regain your tax residency. And so I think there's a bit of a misconception that starts to happen when you're going to work for a U.S. And then the other part of that is, if you do happen to remain a Canadian resident, working for a U.S. company in the United States, but filing as a Canadian resident, that U.S. company technically should be doing Canadian payroll for you, even though you're working in the U.S. because you're a Canadian resident. So there's so many nuances to it that actually make it, it goes back to how you started. We talk the same, we walk the same, we walk the same TV shows. It's easy. The border is like, how long did it take you to cross the border today?
2 seconds.
2
with
seconds.
Nexus.
Like
And you look sketchy,
we
so I'm surprised.
still, as much to the media and certain people's opinion, we still work together very well, right? However, the tax and immigration laws can create a disaster. And I will say Canada is starting to go after this. So we have had, I think we're on our 3rd client now who's received a letter from Canada Revenue Agent saying, please explain to me what this other employment income is that you have. And it's likely because they're looking for employers that are not resident in Canada, that are employing Canadian residents and not doing Canadian payroll properly because they're commuting or whatever. And there's going to be a whole bunch of payroll audits coming out of this. I can almost guarantee it.
A lot of this came after COVID. Like, we've seen people innocently saying, well, I'm going to take a job, I'm going to move to the US, I have my visa, I'm going to be able to do it, and I'm not going to file Canadian taxes anymore. Well, you can't just stop doing that. Like, just because you moved doesn't mean you still have tax obligations. We've also seen people during COVID that said, well, I'm going to pick up a job working for that US company, and I'm going to stay in my house in Canada because everyone's remote. So why can't I do that? And then you're back into, well, wait a minute, where are you really? And just because you toggled your VPN to something doesn't mean you really did it. This happened, right? So this is an area where, like, having a conversation with people who know this is really, really essential. And just assuming is really dangerous.
I think that question of who is a resident for tax purposes and who is a resident for immigration purposes is so important. They are different things, and it gets conflated all the time. I'll also flag, like, one of the top questions I have with folks that do move to the U.S. is whether they can keep their BC healthcare.
Yeah,
And
that's a whole other
BC healthcare is for residents of BC, and if you are a resident in the United States, it does not work, and BC healthcare will sue you for the cost of your treatment. So that's a big one that comes up a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
often when I'm going through people who have blurred the line and have already moved and said, well, but I came back up and had a surgery. And I'm like, well, then I guess you're a Canadian resident and paying Canadian taxes because you can't use our health care for free and not pay taxes.
Yeah, so knowing what you have, what the company can provide, what you have, what entitlements you have, that's really, really essential. And I know many Canadians are like, hey, our healthcare is free, but I had a client made a great joke. He says, yeah, but sometimes it's like bread in communist Poland, it's free, but there isn't any. So that's a whole other conversation.
Awesome.
Feel free to steal that joke.
So I think that's pretty much it. So you can.
Actually,
we have one more question. Okay, so we got 1 minute here.
Hand back there.
Quickly, is any particular state easier to get into versus, or is it all at a federal level first and then a state? And then does that preclude you, let's say if you moved to Nebraska because it was easy and wanted to live in Florida, are you going to have some problems in that scenario?
From a U.S. immigration perspective, no limitations whatsoever. You incorporate in a state. We don't have federal incorporations like in Canada. I don't handle cross-border business. I always make sure I'm working, again, with cross-border business professionals who can advise the client specifically, but
I think Minnesota might be out of the top 10 right now in terms of popularity.
Yeah, I mean, not Minnesota.
Is immigration federal?
Immigration is federal,
yeah.
But
so
business
that's the
formation is, yeah, exactly. Entity formation is going to be state by state, and I think the big considerations there are where are you doing business? You know, if you are actually doing business in California, it very well makes sense to incorporate there. But if you are not, why the heck would you pick California? Because you're going to be paying a lot in taxes.
And California is one of those non-treaty states. So.
I was going to say, yeah. So California. Sorry, I was going to say, so California doesn't follow the Canadian U.S. tax treaty for tax deferral, things like RSPs, for example. So that gets complicated. Places like Rhode Island are really complicated for Canadian financial institutions because the exemptive relief for Rhode Island is the disaster. So they are like, no, we're not talking to you if you go there. So there are some specific differences from which state, but I would say if you're moving there, that's probably not really in the top list of things you should worry about. Go for family or weather or some other thing that's the driver, and then figure out how the rules work or don't work for you.
Yeah.
a big question people often have is, if my business is located here, if I'm incorporated in Washington, can I move to Hawaii? And yes, you can. So, as long as that works from a tax perspective.
Yeah, might have Hawaii reporting, but yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Darren. Appreciate you joining us up here. And thank you, everybody, for participating. And if you have questions, feel free to ask any one of us. If there's something that triggered your brain, you can grab us and we can have a conversation. Thanks, everybody.